In Iowa, the summer of 1890 didn't make a polite entrance. It barged in, an oppressive visitor with no intention of departing. By the middle of July, the mercury was welded to 104 degrees, and the valley had forgotten what rain smelled like. Downtown, the heat warped the very air, creating shimmers above the brick-faced shops. The town's supply of precious ice, won with such brutal effort the prior January, was dissolving into gray puddles on the floors of costly stone cellars. Yet, on a north-facing hill at the county's edge, a bizarre spectacle was unfolding. A slender ribbon of white mist crept from beneath the door of a crude, unattractive wooden shed. It was not smoke, it was cold. As the affluent merchants saw their investments melt into water, a single man's heap of so-called mill trash was holding Winter prisoner. People had called him a fool for building with refuse. He wasn't counting on fortune, however. He was banking on an overlooked principle of physics, which stated that wood, air, and patience could bring the sun to a dead halt. To grasp the significance of that white mist, one must first comprehend the oppressive weight of the season that created it. The Midwest summer of 1890 was marked by a stillness that unsettled even the most seasoned farmers. By midday, the birds fell silent, hoarding their strength in the deep shadows of the oak trees. The creek beds, which typically flowed with clear runoff, had split open to show a parched gray clay that would coat your boots with dust. The atmosphere sat motionless, dense enough to feel like clothing. It was the type of humidity the locals referred to as corn sweat, a phenomenon where moisture would rise from the crops and bear down on the valley floor like a sodden wool blanket, sealing the heat against the land. In such an environment, ice wasn't a simple indulgence for chilling lemonade on a veranda. It was a resource that competed with gold, holding the rank of the third most valuable export in the nation's economy, surpassed only by cotton and grain. It represented the sole barrier between a household and the illnesses that flourished in the heat. It marked the line between fresh milk and spoiled curd, between a safely preserved side of beef and meat that would turn green within a day. The summer complaint, their term for dysentery and food poisoning, haunted the homes that had lost their cold storage. The ice harvest functioned as the town's power source, a stored charge of winter's energy intended to sustain the community through the oppressive dog days. The community understood this importance on a fundamental level. It was the reason they constructed their ice houses to resemble fortresses. The accepted wisdom of the time was straightforward. Permanence equated to protection. The bankers and merchants contracted masons to hew heavy limestone blocks from the local quarry. They delved deep into the ground, convinced the earth would be their salvation. They erected substantial, handsome walls that appeared sturdy enough to repel a cannonball. This logic felt perfectly reasonable to anyone who avoided scrutinizing the thermodynamics too closely. Stone is cool to the touch. Therefore, stone must be effective at keeping things cold. They would boast about the thickness of their walls and the depth of their foundations, certain that their significant investment would keep winter securely contained. They failed to realize that stone is a conduit. It feels cool to the hand because it pulls warmth away from the skin. But this same characteristic means it also draws the heat of the July soil directly into the core of the cellar. They were building structures that had the appearance of refrigerators, but functioned like slow-cooking ovens. They were battling the heat with sheer mass, oblivious to the fact that the heat could simply stroll right through their walls. And then there was Silas. He was a man who existed on the margins, not only of the town itself, but of its entire mode of thought. He lacked the funds for quarried limestone and possessed none of the patience for the town's endless arguments over mortar and excavation depth. He was a person who said little, but observed a great deal. While the masons were busy preparing their heavy cements, Silas could be found down at the river sawmill with a pair of old horses and a wagon with a sagging bed. The mill was a chaotic and hazardous environment, alive with the high-pitched shriek of the circular saw and the potent aroma of fresh pine resin. For the mill foreman, sawdust was a burden, a fire risk that needed to be shoveled, transported, and incinerated. When Silas inquired about hauling it off, the foreman chuckled and invited him to take every shovelful he could manage. He believed he was getting a free cleanup of his floors. Silas, however, knew he was mining for gold. He passed his days there, his shovel moving in a steady rhythm as he tossed the yellow dust into his wagon, paying no mind to the taunts from the men who were hauling solid lumber. He wasn't interested in the strength of the wood itself. He was after the material that fell through the cracks. He grasped something the masons had overlooked. The wood fibers themselves were not the insulation. The real insulation was the millions of tiny, stagnant pockets of air trapped within the dust. He wasn't hauling away trash. He was hauling a vacuum. To appreciate the worth of that sawdust, you must first recognize the cost of the ice itself. You have to pull back from the stifling heat of July and journey back to the preceding January, a time when the river flowing through the valley was not a supply of water, but a quarry of gray, translucent stone. The harvest stood as the single most vital economic undertaking of the winter. It was a harsh, essential act of violence performed upon the landscape, demanding a level of coordination that could be compared to a military operation. The river did not relinquish its winter reserves without a fight. The labor started before sunrise, when the air was so crisp it seemed it might shatter if you moved too quickly. The men who ventured out onto the frozen expanse were not merely laborers. They were assessing the structural soundness of the only barrier separating them from the dark, frigid current that rushed just beneath their feet. They sought out the black ice, the transparent, dense freeze that contained no air bubbles and promised the longest possible defense against the summer's heat. The entire procedure was a case study in applying industrial geometry to the natural world. It started with the marker plow, a cumbersome iron tool pulled by a horse that required special caulked shoes to maintain its balance on the slippery surface. The plow didn't actually cut, it scored. It etched a flawless grid across the white plain, delineating squares that were precisely 22 inches on each side. The sound of the iron scoring the surface was a piercing shriek that bounced off the valley walls, a noise that announced the siege had begun. After the grid was established, the sawyers advanced. These were not the small handsaws found in a carpenter's workshop. They were enormous, 6-foot blades with widely set teeth designed to clear away slush, weighted at the handle to help drive the cut downward. The men toiled in a hypnotic and draining rhythm, their breath forming plumes in the freezing air as they plunged the steel deep into the river. They were carving out free-floating blocks that weighed between 200 and 300 pounds apiece. Every single block was a battery, a compact storage unit of thermal deficit that yearned to revert to its liquid form. The overarching objective of the harvest was to postpone that inevitable transformation for as long as the laws of physics would permit. The peril was unceasing. A horse might slip and break a leg. A sawyer could lose his footing and plunge into the dark channel his own cut had created. If a man fell into the water and went under the ice shelf, he was lost. The current would sweep him away before he could locate the opening again. Despite this, the town labored with a frantic efficiency, dragging thousands of tons of these crystalline blocks up the muddy riverbanks on wooden slides and loading them onto sleds that creaked under the immense weight. Silas was present as well, but he worked a separate stretch of the river, farther upstream where the current was slower and the ice formed thick and clear. While the commercial teams prioritized speed, hacking out any frozen water they could get to, Silas focused on quality. He discarded the snow ice, the opaque white upper layer that was filled with trapped air bubbles. He understood that air within the ice constituted a defect, a vulnerability that would encourage melting from the inside. He harvested only the deepest, most transparent heart of the freeze. He labored by himself, employing a system of levers and ramps that enabled one man to move what should have required 3. He bypassed the town's shared conveyors. He transported his harvest one sled load at a time, arranging the blocks on the bank with a level of precision that seemed pointless to the others. He wasn't merely stacking frozen water. He was orchestrating a thermal defense. He handled each 300-pound cube not as a simple commodity, but as a living entity that was slowly perishing from the moment it was extracted from the river. The distinction in his methodology was already apparent in the winter, though nobody gave it much attention. The town piled its ice into large, jumbled mounds, waiting for wagons to transport it to the stone cellars. Silas, however, covered his immediate harvest with canvas and then snow, shielding it from the winter sun even when the temperature was 10 degrees below zero. He grasped that the war against heat did not begin in July. It commenced the instant the saw completed its cut. The ice was the fuel for the coming summer, but the container he was getting ready to build would be the deciding factor in how long that fuel would last. The town's approach was founded on a hazardous confusion between strength and resistance. To the merchant trying to safeguard his capital, security had the appearance of limestone. It looked like a material that could break a pickaxe. Consequently, once the ice was stacked and the winter gray started to recede, the building of the commercial ice houses began with the same gravity as a bank vault installation. They employed the costliest masons from the county seat. They paid extra for quarried stone, heavy and cold, hauled in on wagons that carved deep, chaotic ruts into the thawing mud of Main Street. They dug far into the earth, going down 12 feet or more, operating under the age-old, flawed belief that the ground itself was a permanent, unassailable haven of cold. They mixed their mortar with river sand and put up walls 18 inches thick, finishing the joints with the pride of men constructing something for the next 100 years. But permanence is not the same as insulation. In their frantic pursuit of durability, they had constructed a flawless thermal bridge. Stone is dense. It registers as cold to the touch on a brisk April morning, a tactile illusion that persuaded them it was the best choice. But stone is a conductor. It readily accepts the energy of its surroundings and transfers it with relentless, efficient speed. Picture a smooth river stone, resting in the shallows under the midday sun. It soaks up that heat, retains it, and becomes a battery of warmth that radiates long after the sun has vanished below the hills. By embedding their stone walls deep in the soil, the townspeople were not insulating their ice. They were connecting it directly to the thermal mass of the surrounding ground. As the summer sun baked the topsoil, that warmth would travel downward, find the limestone, and march through those 18-inch walls as if they were made of paper. The stone didn't halt the heat, it ushered it inside. They constructed for appearances, not for physics. They wanted structures that seemed impenetrable. A massive oak door with black iron hinges feels secure. A slate roof appears impervious to the weather. They built ice houses that were architectural marvels, beautiful, damp, echoing chambers that smelled of wet minerals and misplaced confidence. On Sunday afternoons, the men would stand by their whitewashed fences, smoking pipes and discussing the specifications of their cellars, as if they were generals comparing fortifications. "I dug down 15 feet, one might declare, nodding with solemn satisfaction. "Double-walled limestone with a slate cap," another would brag. They talked about the frost line, as though it were a formal treaty the earth had signed. They were gauging their safety in tons of rock, ignorant that every ton was just another channel for the impending fire of July. They were meticulously constructing ovens and praising themselves on the thickness of the crust. Silas was conspicuously absent from these self-satisfied discussions. You would never find him leaning on the fence rails, debating the virtues of local quarry rock over imported granite. While the town was preoccupied with looking down into their deep, stone-lined holes, Silas was studying the structure of a bird's feather in winter. He was observing how a wool coat keeps a person warm, not by its weight, but by trapping stillness. He understood that to stop heat, you didn't need mass, you needed separation. You had to sever the link between the ice and the world that was desperate to melt it. While they were mortgaging their futures to purchase stone, Silas was getting ready to build with a material the foreman swept from his floor. He turned his back on the quarry's heavy promise. While they built with mass, Silas was preparing to build with air. To the unassisted eye, a mound of sawdust is merely the chaotic residue of a destroyed log, a bother that sticks to boots and irritates the lungs. But Silas wasn't viewing the debris with his unassisted eye. He was picturing it through the lens of a microscope he never possessed. He knew intuitively that wood in its solid form was still a conductor, though a poor one. A solid log could eventually carry the sun's warmth from its outer bark to its inner core, given enough time. But when that same log was pulverized by the violent teeth of a circular saw, its fundamental nature was altered. It was no longer wood. It had become a suspension of cellulose fibers that held millions of microscopic pockets of air captive in a tangled, chaotic matrix. This was the principle of dead air, a concept that the modern world would eventually measure with R values and thermal conductivity charts. Future engineers would demonstrate that a layer of compressed sawdust less than 3 centimeters thick, could equal the insulating capability of a full centimeter of modern polyurethane. But Silas understood it simply as stillness. Heat travels through motion, through the vibration of molecules passing energy to their neighbors, or through the currents of rising and falling air. By trapping air in spaces so small that it could not circulate, the sawdust effectively paralyzed the heat. It compelled the thermal energy to battle its way through a billion tiny wooden obstacles, losing its force with every fraction of an inch it attempted to advance. While the neighbors' solid limestone walls provided a paved superhighway for heat to travel into their cellars, the loose pine shavings formed a dense, impassable jungle where the temperature simply got lost. The procurement of this material developed into a daily ritual that spring. Silas became a regular sight at the mill, backing his wagon up to the waste chutes while the commercial timber purchasers watched with amused disdain. He shoveled with a consistent, rhythmic pace, loading the green dust that was still heavy with the sap of the living tree. This was the crucial danger that a casual observer would miss. Fresh sawdust, straight from the blade, is a living chemical substance. It is damp, full of sugars, and susceptible to fermentation. If Silas had merely taken this green dust and packed it into his walls, he would have engineered a catastrophe. The moisture would have rotted the timber frame of his ice house, and even worse, the composting action would have generated its own warmth, a slow, biological fire that would have melted his ice from the outside in. Therefore, the work didn't stop at the wagon. On his property, on a flat piece of hard-packed ground far from his house, Silas spread his harvest out in thin layers under the pre-summer sun. He wasn't just piling it, he was curing it. Each day, he walked the rows with a wooden rake, turning the shavings over and exposing the damp lower layers to the wind. He required the sap to crystallize and the water to evaporate completely. He needed the dust to change from a heavy, clumping material into a dry, flowing powder that rustled when you kicked it. To guarantee it stayed that way, he mixed in dry lime, a white powder that served as a chemical guard against rot and rodents. The town observed this process with a skepticism that verged on hostility. To them, Silas was amassing a disaster. They looked at the growing mounds of dry wood dust and saw a tinderbox awaiting a spark. They whispered about the danger of fire, about the madness of surrounding precious ice with the most flammable substance in the county. They cautioned that it would become a nesting place for rats, a haven for termites, a sponge that would absorb the summer rain and decay into a foul-smelling sludge. They could not resolve the contradiction. How could one possibly protect ice with the very fuel used to start a fire in a stove? Silas paid no attention to the warnings. He was aware that dry sawdust, when packed tightly, actually resists burning because it lacks the oxygen flow necessary to sustain a flame. Much like a closed book is more difficult to ignite than loose pages. He carried on with his raking, day after day, waiting for the color to change from the pale yellow of fresh-cut pine to the deep, dry gold of cured insulation. He checked the moisture by plunging his hand deep into the center of the piles. If he detected even a hint of dampness, he turned it over again. He wasn't simply drying trash, he was manufacturing a shield. By the time he was done, he had mounds of material that were lighter than air and drier than sand. He wasn't just piling it up, he was engineering a vacuum. When the time finally arrived to break ground, Silas did something that made the neighbors stop their own digging to watch. The prevailing wisdom in the valley was that cold air resided in the low spots, in the damp hollows where fog settled in the mornings. For this reason, the townspeople constructed their ice houses in the bottomlands, near the creek beds, seeking the natural chill of the depressions. Silas did the exact opposite. He walked past the hollows and ascended to a rise on the north side of his property, a location that caught the wind but was shielded from the southern path of the sun by a grove of old-growth oak trees. It appeared to be sheer madness to erect a cold storage building on a hill, exposed to the summer breeze. But Silas wasn't yet thinking about the air temperature. He was thinking about the water table. He understood a thermodynamic principle that the cellar builders had ignored to their own detriment. Water is a vastly more efficient conductor of heat than air. If an ice block rests in a puddle of its own meltwater, it is doomed. The water serves as a liquid contact patch, transferring the Earth's warmth directly into the ice 20 times faster than the surrounding air would. A damp cellar is not a preservative. It is a slow-motion bath of destruction. By building on the rise, Silas ensured that gravity would act as his first line of defense. Before he laid a single piece of timber, he shaped the earth itself, grading the clay soil into a gentle slope that fell away from the center, creating a natural watershed that would instantly carry any drop of moisture away from the core. Over this prepared clay, he did not pour concrete or lay down flat stones. He brought in wagon loads of coarse river gravel, washing it until the water ran clear through it. He spread this rock a foot deep, tamping it down until it was firm yet porous. Atop the gravel, he laid a bed of cinders, the black, jagged refuse from the railway station's coal furnaces. Cinders were sharp, they didn't retain moisture, and they created thousands of small air pockets beneath the floor. This was his thermal break. By the time he laid the heavy oak sleepers, the beams that would support the floorboards, they were floating a full 18 inches above the damp ground, separated by layers of material that refused to draw moisture upward. The structure that started to rise from this foundation baffled the casual observer even more. It featured no windows. Its door faced strictly north. The rough timber siding was coated with a stark, blinding layer of white lime wash to reflect the sun's glare. The roof was pitched at an aggressive angle, far steeper than a barn roof would need to be to shed snow. And most baffling of all was the wooden pipe that stuck out from the ridgeline. It resembled a chimney, yet there was no stove inside, no hearth, and no fire. The neighbors quipped that Silas was building a smokehouse for a giant, or perhaps a church for a congregation of one. They did not recognize it as a thermal chimney. Silas knew that no insulation is ever perfect. Some amount of heat would inevitably get through the roof as the July sun beat down on the shingles. If that heat were to become trapped in the attic, it would build up, pressing down upon the ice like a heavy hand. The steep roof and the tall wooden pipe were engineered to harness the stack effect. As the air in the attic space warmed, it would naturally rise, rushing up the steep pitch and escaping through the chimney. This upward draft would in turn create a vacuum, pulling in cooler air from the shaded vents located at the eaves. The building was designed to breathe, to continually flush out the fever of the afternoon sun without any mechanical assistance. He had planned this specific orientation months earlier, in the dead of February. While others were huddled near their fires, Silas had been out on the rise, driving stakes into the frozen earth, observing where the shadows of the oak trees fell at noon. He calculated the sun's angle at the summer solstice, guaranteeing that when the heat reached its absolute zenith in June and July, the roof of his icehouse would be almost completely in the shade of the tree canopy. He wasn't just constructing a box. He was placing a needle on a compass, aligning his survival with the geometry of the solar system. With the ground prepared and the physics of the airflow established, the walls began to rise, layer by distinct layer. As the skeleton of the building rose against the spring sky, the true oddity of Silas's design finally became clear to onlookers. He wasn't constructing a single barn. He was building one structure inside of another, like a ship placed in a bottle, with a noticeable 12-inch gap separating the inner shell from the outer skin. This was the double-wall anomaly, a piece of engineering that appeared wasteful to someone counting lumber expenses, but was vital to a man counting thermal units. The crucial detail, which was invisible from the road, was the arrangement of the vertical studs. A lazy carpenter would have lined them up, nailing the inner wall supports directly in line with the outer ones, maybe even linking them with cross-bracing for added stability. Silas did the opposite. He staggered the studs, making sure that the timber supporting the inner sanctum never made physical contact with the timber that supported the weather-beaten exterior. He understood that wood, while superior to stone, was still a bridge. If a single beam connected the July heat to the January ice, the energy would travel across it like a spark running down a fuse. By decoupling the frames, he guaranteed that the only thing connecting the two worlds was the air he was about to trap. Then came the process of packing. This was not a simple matter of dumping the cured sawdust into the gap and walking away. Gravity is the adversary of insulation. Over time, any loose fill will settle, creating a hollow space at the top of the wall where heat can invade. Silas approached the packing process with the same rigor a mason would use when pouring concrete. He would pour a foot of the golden, dry dust into the cavity, then take a heavy, flat-ended post and tamp it down. He wasn't compacting it into a solid block. That would have crushed the air pockets. But he was firming it just enough to prevent future settling. It was a delicate balance, a tactile negotiation between density and loft. He worked his way upward, foot by foot, enveloping the inner chamber in a continuous 12-inch blanket of suspended air. The roof demanded a different approach. Heat rises, but the sun beats down from above, creating a radiant oven in the attic space. Silas constructed a heavy ceiling over the inner chamber, sealing it tightly. Above that, in the loft, he didn't rely solely on the sawdust. He piled 3 feet of loose straw and shavings, forming a massive, breathable thermal cap. It was so thick that even if the attic temperature soared to 120 degrees, the heat would exhaust itself trying to penetrate the tangle of dry stalks long before it ever reached the ceiling boards. The final line of defense was the entrance. A single door represents a point of failure. Every time you open it, you are inviting the summer inside. Silas built a vestibule, a small, dark antechamber equipped with an outer door and an inner door. It was a crude form of airlock. You opened the outer door, stepped into the small, sawdust-lined room, and closed the world off behind you. Only when that outer seal was secure did you open the inner door to the ice. This design forced a pause, a ritual of entry that stopped the outside atmosphere from rushing the gates. When the structure was finally complete, Silas transferred his harvest from the temporary snow piles into the vault. He did not simply stack the blocks. He packed sawdust between every single layer, isolating each 300-pound cube within its own private cocoon. He was constructing a monolith of cold, a solid mass where the ice blocks shared their temperature only with each other and nothing else. When the last block was set in place and the inner door was latched, the silence inside the vault was total. The thick walls of dust absorbed every sound from the outside world. The birds, the wind, the distant saws, leaving only the heavy, expectant quiet of a winter that refused to come to an end. Spring made its arrival in the valley, not as a visual change, but as a sound. It commenced with the rhythmic, unceasing dripping from the eaves of the barns, a percussion of water that announced the breaking of the frost. The hard, brittle silence of January gave way to the noise of movement. Mud grew deeper on the roads. The creek swelled with gray runoff, and the air lost its sharp edge, replacing it with the damp, heavy scent of wet earth and waking roots. For the men who had mortgaged their winter's labor to fill the stone cellars, this seasonal shift produced a specific, gnawing anxiety. The ice was no longer a harvest. It was now a wasting asset. This anxiety compelled them to visit the heavy oak doors of their limestone vaults. It is a human tendency to check on what one values, to confirm with our own eyes that our treasure remains safe. Throughout March and April, the neighbors would unlatch their cellars, swinging the heavy doors wide to gaze into the darkness. They convinced themselves they were only checking the levels, or maybe retrieving a small block for an early spring beverage. They did not comprehend the physics of their own curiosity. Each time they opened that door, they invited the spring inside. The heavy, moisture-rich air of April rushed into the cool void, condensing instantly on the cold stone walls. The limestone began to sweat. The dampness settled on the straw that covered the ice, heavy and warm. They were comforting themselves with a glance, but they were paying for it with the lifespan of their inventory. The proof of this invasion appeared swiftly. By May, the men started to notice the shrinkage. The sharp, crystalline edges of their river blocks were beginning to soften. The distinct geometry of the harvest was losing its definition, the blocks fusing together into a slushy, shapeless mass. Dark puddles began to appear on the cellar floors, trickling toward the drains, the liquid ghosts of the labor they had performed in the cold. Silas, in contrast, did not open his door. For 3 months, he walked past the double-walled anomaly on the rise without ever breaking his stride. He checked the hinges and inspected the roof, but he never once touched the latch. This demanded a discipline that ran counter to every instinct of a farmer. To plant a seed is to wait for the sprout, but one can watch corn grow. To store ice behind a wall of sawdust is to place your faith in a mathematical abstraction. He had to believe that the 12 inches of dead air were performing their duty in the darkness. He had to trust the calculation over the reassurance of his own eyes. To open the door would be to break the seal, to disrupt the stillness he had so carefully engineered. He knew the ice was safe, not because he could see it, but because he understood the laws that governed it. The only alteration visible to the valley was on the building's exterior. The steep roof, covered in rough shingles, stayed dark, but the earth banked up around the foundation began to breathe. The grass seeds Silas had scattered there took root, and soon the base of the ice house was bearded in thick, green oats. It looked like a natural part of the hill, a living thing rather than a man-made structure. But the true evidence of his success was the one thing that was absent. At the base of the gravel foundation, where the clay drain pipe emerged to carry off any meltwater, the ground was dusty and dry. While the drains of the stone cellars were already weeping a steady trickle of gray water into the ditches, Silas's pipe remained as parched as a bone. The winter inside was holding its breath. Spring had been gentle, but summer descended with a hammer. As June turned into July, the atmospheric pressure over the valley intensified, locking the area into a weather pattern that the old-timers would discuss for decades. The humidity rose from the cornfields, forming a dome of moisture that trapped the sun's radiation against the earth. The nights provided no respite. The temperature at midnight hovered in the 80s, and the ground, which normally cooled after sunset, began to retain its heat. The soil temperature, steadily increasing inch by inch, depth by depth, started its slow, unavoidable march toward the town's foundations. This was the moment the stone cellars betrayed their masters. The heavy limestone walls, buried 12 feet deep, had spent the previous 3 months soaking up the thermal energy of the surrounding earth. The thermal lag, the time it takes for heat to travel through a material, had finally run its course. The walls were no longer barriers, they were radiators. The men who went down into their vaults to salvage what was left were met not with the crisp, dry chill of winter, but with a suffocating, damp heat that smelled of wet wool and stagnant water. The ice didn't stand a chance. It wasn't melting from the outside in anymore, it was rotting. The structural integrity of the blocks failed, collapsing into a gray, tepid slurry that washed away the profits of the season in a tide of mud and straw. The consequences migrated from the ledger to the dinner table. The first casualty was the milk. Without ice to cool the cans, the morning delivery was sour by noon. Then came the meat. The local butcher, whose shop depended on a stone-lined cooling room, watched helplessly as his inventory spoiled. The sweet, metallic scent of fresh beef was replaced by the cloying, sickly sweet odor of decay that hung heavy in the humid air. A quiet panic began to spread. The town wasn't just losing money, it was losing its ability to feed itself safely. The summer complaint flared up in households across the valley, a direct consequence of food that had sat too long in the warmth. The breaking point arrived in the second week of August. A child in the center of town developed a fever that would not subside. The doctor, a man who believed in the old methods of cooling the blood, went to his own ice house, then to the general store, and then to the butcher. In every heavy, expensive stone vault, he discovered the same thing: dark water and the muddy remnants of straw. There was no solid ice left in the valley. The town's fortress of stone had fallen. The realization struck them with the force of a physical blow. Their permanence had been an illusion. They had battled the heat with weight, and the heat had won. The very mass they had relied on was now cooking them. There was only one place left to look. It was a humiliating necessity that drove a small delegation, led by the doctor, up the dust-choked road toward the north rise. The heat shimmered off the gravel, distorting the horizon and making the air look as if it were boiling. As they climbed, sweat stinging their eyes, they looked toward the rough timber shed that Silas had built. It sat there in the glare, ugly and silent, its steep roof baking in the sun. They anticipated finding the same failure they had left behind: a puddle of water leaking from beneath the door, a smell of damp rot, and an old man who had learned the hard way that wood cannot stop the sun. They came expecting to find a fool, hoping only to find a miracle, but dreading the reality of the gray water they were certain awaited them. The delegation stopped at the edge of the gravel pad, their boots crunching on stone that was surprisingly dry. In town, the ground was a muddy paste of meltwater and dust, but here, the drainage engineering held true. The heat radiating off the gravel was visible, a wavering distortion that made the timber shed look like a mirage shimmering in a desert. To the touch, the outer pine siding was burning hot, dry, rough, and smelling of baked resin. It felt less like a building and more like the side of a kiln. The doctor, sweat dripping from the brim of his hat, looked at Silas. His eyes held the desperate, hollow look of a man who had seen too many empty cellars that day. Silas didn't offer a defense. He didn't explain the R value of pine or the theory of thermal bridging. He simply reached for the iron latch of the outer door. It lifted with a dry clack. He swung the heavy timber barrier open, revealing the vestibule. It wasn't cold yet. It was neutral. The air inside the small, dark airlock smelled intensely of pine and straw, but it lacked the suffocating, wet weight of the outside humidity. There was no sound of dripping water, no sickly sweet smell of rot, just the dry, dusty scent of the mill. Silas motioned them inside and closed the outer door behind them, plunging the group into a sudden, resin-scented twilight. They stood there for a moment in the cramped space, the ferocious heat of the day separated from them by only insulated walls, waiting for the air to settle. Then Silas turned to the inner door. This latch was different. It was sweating. Condensation beaded on the cold iron, the only moisture visible in the entire structure. He threw the bolt and pulled. It didn't feel like a door opening. It felt like a dam breaking. The air that rolled out wasn't just cool, it was heavy. It poured over the threshold in a visible, white cascade, a laminar flow of dense, freezing atmosphere that tumbled down around their boots like dry ice fog. It was the breath of January, stored in the dark for 6 months, released violently into the swelter of August. The temperature in the vestibule dropped 30 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. The sweat on the doctor's arms flashed cold. Silas raised the lantern, the flame flickering in the sudden draft. There, in the center of the vault, sat the monolith. It wasn't a slushy, rounded mound of gray wash like the others. It was a fortress. The sawdust packing had been pulled back to reveal the face of the harvest. The blocks were square. The edges were sharp enough to cut a finger. The clarity of the river water was still there, preserved in the absolute darkness. The sawdust hadn't just insulated the ice. It had suspended time. The heat of the summer, furious and relentless, had spent weeks trying to navigate the millions of tiny air pockets in the walls, getting lost in the microscopic maze of cellulose, losing its energy long before it could touch the prize. The doctor didn't speak. He stepped forward, his breath pluming white in the lantern light, and placed his hand on the nearest block. It was dry. The sawdust brushed off easily, leaving clean, hard ice beneath. In a world melting into chaos, Silas had preserved a cubic rod of winter through the simple application of patience and waste. They loaded the wagon in silence, wrapping the sharp, cold blocks in wool blankets. The ice that cooled the fever that night wasn't a miracle. It was just geometry. The heat wave eventually broke, as all fevers do, but the town's perspective had shifted permanently. The stone cellars were slowly filled in or repurposed, while double-walled timber sheds began to rise on the north slopes of the valley. They learned that fighting nature with weight helps you lose, but understanding its language helps you survive. Sometimes, the strongest wall is the one made of nothing but air. If you want to uncover more forgotten history, watch this next video. Subscribe to keep the wisdom alive.